So let's talk about Breitling and why they're so dismissed in the community. Hi, I'm Pete McConville. Welcome to Not So Obvious Watches. And today I'm going to be talking about Breitling and a little bit about their history and kind of how they got to where they are. Where this came from is, like most YouTubers, I was preparing to look at the new releases that Breitling just made. As part of my research for that, I have a look at what other people are saying, get ideas, get a sense of what's going on inside the zeitgeist. Not to follow it, but really just to make sure I don't miss anything, or to maybe I pick up bits of context which on my own I wouldn't have seen. In going through that, one of the things I found was that there's essentially, within the YouTube community, there's a sense of real dismissiveness towards Breitling. If you listen to Ricky on Scottish Watches, he cannot wait for this to be gone, so he just doesn't have to talk about this brand anymore. If you look at Adrian on Bark and Jack, there's a thread of frank mockery running through his entire discussion about Breitling, and that struck me not as odd, because I'm not an idiot, I've been listening to what goes on in the community, that it didn't surprise me that a lot of people see Breitling this way, but it did make me stop and think really hard about why is that? Why don't people sort of appreciate where Breitling's come from or what they are now? What is it about that means they don't seem to be able to understand what's going on in the Breitling now? And what does that mean for the new releases? Now, I tried to film that video. It turned out to be like 45 minutes long, which is exactly what I shouldn't do for YouTube. I am trying to get shorter, punchier, but also a bit more casual. So I've decided I took that video, locked it away in the archive, and I'm coming back now, breaking that idea into kind of like three. So what Breitling's history is and how they got them to this point. Then on my next video is going to be kind of what George Kern is trying to do to the current Breitling and take it forward. And then after that, I'm going to look at what are the watches that Breitling's coming out with over the recent past and how they kind of fit into that, so we can understand where they go. I'll also talk about my opinion of those watches. First, I really should give some of my kind of history with Breitling, because I think that's important to understand a whole bunch of things. Okay, so I'm 53 years old. I got involved in aviation formally I got involved in aviation, I suppose, in 85 when I joined the Australian Air Force. Really, if you could think of it as a few years prior to that, when, you know, as a young kid I'm interested in aviation, going to air shows, buying the magazines, blah blah blah. And during that time, Breitling is just everywhere. And Breitling in the late 80s, early 90s is a pretty well respected brand. It doesn't carry any of the negative connotations it's certainly got now. That is when Breitling became who they are in my mind. So that's an important thing. Think about that as we move through the story. When thinking about Breitling and their history, you really have to think that there are essentially four Breitlings. There's the Breitling family Breitling, 1884 to around about 1979. There's Ernst Schneider Breitling, which is 1979 to somewhere in around the mid to late 90s. Then there's Teddy Schneider Breitling, which is somewhere from the mid 90s up to 2018. And then there's George Kern Breitling, which is really from now forward. I'm going to be focusing really on those first three Breitlings, because they're the ones that have shaped, and in fact that last one in particular is what I believe is shaping a lot of people's ideas about who Breitling has been, and probably more importantly who they can be in the future. So if you go back to that original Breitling family Breitling, even starting in 1884, they were always a useful tool maker. You know, they made stopwatches for timing things. They made clocks for dashboards of cars. They made clocks for cockpits of aeroplanes. They turned into wristwatches and brought that usefulness concept with them. Always making watches which specified their purpose in life. So lots of chronometers, lots of chronographs that were used to time everything from bicycle races, car races, and obviously ended up becoming pilots' watches and used in aviation a lot. And that focus on usefulness, on being good at what they had to do, served Breitling pretty well right up until it became their absolute Achilles heel, and that's during the quartz crisis. Because the exact things that Breitling was best at, that really Breitling hung its hat on, were the precise things that it could never match quartz in. It could never match. It didn't matter how good you were as a mechanical watchmaker, you were never going to match quartz for accuracy and usefulness and tooliness. So Breitling was kind of screwed. Now, Willie Breitling was a very smart man. He knew this. He saw this coming. He tried to incorporate quartz into his watches. If you look at Breitling during the 70s, you'll see a dizzying array of quartz technology coming into his watches. What he couldn't deal with, whilst he was dealing with the technology, what he couldn't deal with was all the other things that were going on during this so-called quartz crisis. We tend to focus on the technology, but actually the technology wasn't the issue. Really what there was also going on was a whole bunch of things, and I've done a whole video on this before, about currency crunches, about credit crunches, and about global shifts and Swiss shifts in what you're allowed to import and export. Those things, those controls about even though Willie Breitling saw the technology coming, it didn't help him with his cost base. And so in the end, by late 79, he saw the writing on the wall and started taking steps to protect his company. He knew he couldn't protect the financial thing, so he was prepared to let that go. But what he wanted to do was protect his brand and his IP. Therefore, in early 79, he sold all the important bits, all the IP, all the brands, all the trademarks. They got sold to Ernst Schneider, and that was allowed to continue. And he allowed the, if you like, the husk, the corporate identity, not the brand identity, to die in August 1979. And that really brings us up to the Ernst Schneider period. Now, Ernst Schneider was also a watch guy. He owned his own watch company called Sakura, small, low-end, not really that prestigious. He was also an entrepreneur. He ran a technology company. He was a pilot. He was lots of different things. He was also very smart. He knew, well, he wasn't the only one. Pretty much everyone had worked out that the future of the mechanical watch was in being a luxury item. And so he beautifully, frankly, managed that line for Breitling for around about 15 years of luxury tooliness, of taking what was great about the Breitling up until the quartz crisis and then adding that luxury spin to it, making it something that you would want to have. And so during his time, Breitling re-establishes itself as a credible watchmaker, this time amping up the luxury just a little bit, but also kind of keeping that tool aesthetic. That's probably best summed up by what he did with the mid-80s Chronomat, where you really do see this kind of collision of luxury and tooliness at a really high peak. And the interesting thing is, it's during that time that I see Breitling, that Breitling starts to intrude on my consciousness. And while I'm not at that time, frankly, I'm not into watches. I'm not a watch guy. It's during that time that I get my idea of, oh, Breitling's important, and Breitling's good, and Breitling's credible. And that's, as I said, an interesting idea. So with the handover from Ernst Schneider to Teddy Schneider, what you saw was the luxury part of Breitling continue to get amped up, and the tool part of Breitling begin to go away. Teddy clearly saw that that's where the market was heading, and that's where he can make the most money. And I think for a while he was probably right. Breitling in the late 90s, early 2000s was doing okay. Some okay watches, some decent sales, and there's no real tremors in the marketplace about their problem. Post 2000, you start to see some interesting issues. Go back and look at old archived like watch time or forum posts, and around about 2002, 2004, you start to see the first tremors in forum posts about people talking about their concerns about the Breitling brand, their concerns about industry inventory control, their concerns about dumping on the grey market, their concerns about the size and the flashiness, even then. So we're now talking 15 years ago. And I think what happened there was Teddy saw a good thing. Teddy saw big, bold, brassy was popular. Teddy saw luxury was popular. Teddy was selling well. And so he doubled down on it. Watches got bigger and bigger. 44, what a Navitime was originally 38 to 40 millimeters. It became 48, 50 millimeters. Now they became totally polished all over, crazy colors, mother of pearl, and it just completely left its old stomping ground. Not only that, it focused entirely on one particular thing, which is aviation. So every single watch got the bee with the wings, and that became associated with Breitling. In some ways, Teddy wasn't. You can't leave out the marketing, the incredibly, depending on how you look at it, incredibly virile and macho marketing, or the incredibly sexist and misogynist and just crazy marketing. In a way, what I would say is Teddy was amazingly successful in forging a new identity of Breitling. Those things he did, he was really successful. He made that the identity of Breitling. Unfortunately, there's a problem. That didn't stay popular. And the generation of YouTubers coming through now are all, frankly, I'm one of the older ones going around. If you look at Adrian from Bark and Jack, or Jory from Time Teller, or the guys from Scottish Watches, they're all younger. They got their ideas of who Breitling is. They formed their concept of who Breitling is during the Teddy years. For them, that is all Breitling is, and it's also all Breitling can be. It can only be cheap and gaudy and sexist and backwards looking and kind of tacky, and that comes through in the way that they talk about Breitling, and I think that's a shame. Whilst I completely understand it, focusing on 15 years of a 130 something year history is really doing us watch fans out of an opportunity. Because if you forget that last 15 years, which I will call the bad Breitling years, there's actually an amazing well of things to draw upon. There's this amazing resource that we, the watch community, we watch enthusiasts, can draw on to enrich the environment we work in. If we're prepared to forgive a bad time in Breitling's life, if we're prepared to let them move on, then and accept that they can be better than they have been, because they have been better than they have been, then I think we are better off for it. This isn't about, forgiving Breitling. This isn't about helping them, understanding them because they need it. This is about helping them. Okay, one of the downsides of working outside is my cat walks on the fence behind me and the dog next door gets angry. That's what you're hearing. I'll go wind back a bit now that all the barking has settled down. What I was trying to say is that I'm not advocating that we reconsider Breitling for Breitling's sake. I'm not advocating that we owe Breitling anything. None of that is true. Some people have sort of taken that from one of my previous videos. Now, what I'm driving towards is, if we don't give Breitling an opportunity to show that they can be better, then we miss out. We miss out on all of that wonderful history. We miss out on what could come in the future. If we decide that we've given up on Breitling and that they're not worth looking at anymore, yeah, look, bad things can happen to Breitling, and that's Breitling's problem. I don't care. I'm not a shareholder. The real issue is that we miss out on watches. We are constantly talking about the way that, and complaining about the way that, all watches are starting to look the same. Such a small number of watches constantly get on rotation, that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of change. And yet we are the ones, by not allowing companies to change, by not accepting that they can be different than they were, that are actually reinforcing the exact behaviors we complain about. So whilst I'm talking here about Breitling and why we should remember what they have been in the past and give them the opportunity to grow into that again. It's probably true of every brand that whenever a brand comes out, whilst we should be wary of their recent history, we should always bear in mind the idea that maybe this will surprise us. Maybe they can be more than they are. And I think we do see that occasionally. Zodiac is doing something very similar at the moment. Timex is doing something very similar at the moment. And I suspect that Breitling is trying desperately to do something like that at the moment. And that's really it for the day. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. There'll be a part 2 to this video of where Breitling is actually going under the leadership of George Kearns. And then there'll be it won't really be a part 3. After I've done that, I'll go to start looking at what some actual Breitling watches that have been released this year. Anyway, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you later. Bye.